The wind carried the smell of smoke across the dry land. Curling through the canyon and over the scattered rocks where the sun had baked the earth into dust, the sky stretched wide and empty, a pale shade of blue that gave no promise of rain. The land was quiet except for the steady groan of the wind and the faint cry of a hawk high above. In that silence, two young women stumbled through the desert, their faces drawn with hunger and their lips cracked from thirst. Their dresses were torn, and their boots left small, uneven prints behind them. They had been walking for 2 days without food and barely any water. Every step seemed heavier than the one before, and the horizon never seemed to change. The older sister tried to stay strong, though her eyes had lost the brightness they once held. She had promised their father before he died that she would protect her sister no matter what. But promises made in safety feel different when the land turns against you. The younger one, barely more than a girl, leaned against her, whispering through dry lips that she couldn't go on. Her voice broke in the wind, and she nearly fell. The older sister caught her and kept her moving, though her own knees shook beneath her weight. Somewhere beyond those sun-baked hills was the settlement they had been told about, a small trading post near the river, where food and help might still be found. But that was 2 days ago, and the map her father had drawn was now lost to the sand. The world around them was not kind. The old lands of the Apache stretched for miles, marked by cliffs, dry rivers, and thorny brush that seemed alive in the heat. It was their father who had warned them never to travel this route. He said the Apache had eyes in the mountains and could strike before a man even drew his weapon, but the sisters had no choice. When their wagon broke and the rest of their party scattered, this path was all that was left. Now it was just them in the endless desert, where even the air seemed to whisper stories of those who never made it through. By late afternoon, the sun turned red and low in the sky. The younger sister could no longer walk. She dropped to her knees beside a patch of dry sage and pressed her forehead to the ground. The older one knelt beside her, trying to lift her again, but her strength had left her too. The air trembled with heat. The world was fading into a blur when a sound rose in the distance, soft at first, like the padding of an animal's steps. She looked up and saw a dark figure moving between the rocks. Her heart jumped. She reached for the small knife tied to her waist, though her hand was shaking. The figure stepped closer, quiet as a shadow. It was a man, tall and lean, his hair long and black, his face painted with dust and sun. Across his chest hung a bow, and behind him trailed a horse with no saddle. For a moment he stood still, watching them with dark, unreadable eyes. The older sister gripped her knife tighter, though she knew she could not fight. The man looked from one to the other, then slowly dismounted. Without a word, he opened a leather pouch at his side and drew out a piece of dried meat and a small skin of water, placed them on the ground between them, and stepped back. Neither sister moved. They had heard stories, wild ones, of what Apache warriors did to settlers caught on their land. Yet hunger and fear are a cruel pair, and soon the older one reached for the food. She tore it in half and gave it to her sister. The taste of it was rough and salty, but to them it felt like life itself. When they were done, the man nodded once, still silent, and motioned for them to follow. The older sister hesitated, but the look in his eyes was not the look of a man who meant harm. It was the look of someone who understood what it meant to be lost in a land that demanded strength to survive. They followed him as the light faded, though their steps were weak and uncertain. He led them across a narrow valley and through a path that twisted between stones shaped by centuries of wind. When night came, he built a small fire and shared a portion of corn and water with them. The sisters huddled close to the flames, listening to the distant calls of coyotes. The man sat apart, sharpening his knife on a flat stone, his gaze fixed on the fire but his mind somewhere far away. His silence was not cold, just practiced. In him there was the calm of someone who had lived too long in a world that rarely offered peace. The younger sister finally spoke, her voice trembling. She asked his name, but he did not answer. Instead, he looked at the stars, then at the horizon, as if listening to something the others could not hear. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of smoke again, stronger now, and the older sister noticed how his eyes narrowed when he caught it too. He rose to his feet and looked to the north. The air seemed to tighten around him. Then, without warning, he knelt and began erasing their footprints in the sand, his movements quick and sure. The sisters watched in confusion. He turned to them and said only one word, firm and low-hide. His voice was deep, almost like a whisper from the earth itself. He motioned toward a hollow between two rocks and pulled a small brush of branches over the opening once they had crawled inside. They crouched there, hearts pounding, the smell of smoke thicker now, the sky above flickering orange in places. Then they heard it, the echo of gunfire, faint but sharp in the distance. The Apache's horse snorted softly, restless. The man placed a hand on its neck to calm it. For hours, the night trembled with the sound of far-off battle. The older sister clutched her sibling's hand, praying silently that whoever was fighting would not come their way. When the shooting stopped, the silence felt heavier than before. The Apache man returned to the fire and covered it with sand. His face was hard, but there was a trace of something deeper, a shadow of worry, maybe grief. The younger sister whispered, asking what was happening, but he only said, "Tomorrow, the land changes." Neither of them understood what he meant, but his tone chilled them. That night, the older sister could barely sleep. She watched the flicker of stars through the thin cracks in their shelter and wondered who this man really was. A savior? A hunter? She wanted to ask, yet something in his stillness kept her silent. At dawn, he was already awake, saddling his horse. The sun broke over the ridges, painting the desert gold. He gave them water again and pointed toward the west. "River," he said simply, then turned his gaze back to the north, where a faint plume of smoke rose against the sky. His jaw tightened, and his hand brushed the bow on his back. The sisters watched him, uncertain whether to thank him or follow. The older one finally spoke, her voice quiet. "You saved us, why?" He paused, his eyes shifting from the smoke to them. "Because you were hungry," he said, "and the hungry should not die in peace before the war begins, before they could ask more." He mounted his horse and rode toward the rising smoke, leaving them standing in the cool morning air, dust swirling around his trail. The sisters turned to look at each other, unsure if they had just met a savior or a ghost of the land. As the sound of his horse faded, a deep rumble echoed through the valley, the sound of cannons far away, rolling like thunder over the desert. The younger sister gripped her sister's arm, her voice shaking. "What war?" The older one looked toward the horizon where the smoke thickened and the sky darkened in the north. She didn't answer. All she could feel was the weight of the Apache's words, lingering like the heat in the sand. Oh, something was coming, something that would burn the land clean of its silence. And it had already begun. The sisters stood for a long time after the Apache disappeared into the red dust, listening to the far-off sounds of the land, the echo of wind across the ridges, the quiet clatter of loose stones, and that faint, heavy thunder that seemed to come from deep inside the earth. Neither spoke. They were too tired and too unsure of what the day would bring. The younger sister's hand trembled as she brushed the dirt from her dress. Her eyes followed the thin trail of smoke that rose in the distance, twisting in the early light. "He said war," she whispered. "Do you think he meant soldiers?" The older sister didn't answer right away. She looked toward the north, where the smoke swelled like a storm cloud, then back toward the west, where the land dipped toward the river the Apache had pointed to. "I don't know," she said. "But if there's fighting, we need to move before it reaches us." They began to walk, though their legs still felt weak from the days of hunger. The land stretched wide and quiet again, only the hum of the wind filling their ears. They didn't know the name of the man who had saved them, and maybe that was better. He had come like a ghost and left the same way, silent, sudden, and with a weight in his eyes that spoke of things they couldn't yet understand. The older sister thought about his words over and over. Before the war begins? Had it already begun? And if it had, who was fighting? By midday, the sun was burning bright again, turning the sand into gold. They followed a dry stream, hoping it would lead to the river. The younger sister's steps dragged, but the older one kept pushing her forward, talking softly to keep her mind awake. She told her stories from when they were children, about the time they'd watched their father trade furs in town, the smell of the horses, the laughter of the men around the fire. It felt far away now, almost like a dream that didn't belong to them anymore. Their father had once been a trapper, quiet but proud, a man who knew the land better than most settlers ever would. He had warned them about these territories, the Apache lands, where the Apache mountains held spirits, and the rivers carried stories of blood and loss. He said the war between settlers and tribes was like dry grass waiting for a spark. One wrong move, one broken promise, and everything would burn. But when he died last winter, all his warnings became just words, lost in the wind. Now his daughters were walking through that same fire without even knowing it. As they moved west, the signs of unrest began to show. They passed a wagon turned on its side, half buried in sand. A torn flag hung from the wheel, its colors faded. A broken rifle lay nearby, rusted at the barrel. The younger sister stopped, her face pale. "Do you think someone's still here?" she asked. The older one shook her head. "No one leaves their wagon unless they have to." Still, she searched the ground for tracks. She saw footprints, some small, some large, scattered in every direction, and beside them, the marks of hooves pressed deep into the earth. Whatever had happened here was recent. The air seemed heavier as the day went on. The sky darkened at the edges, and the wind carried faint cries, not of men, but of the land itself, bending under something unseen. When they finally reached the river, its muddy banks felt like salvation. They dropped to their knees and drank, the water warm and murky but alive. The older sister washed the dust from her face and looked across the flowing water. On the far side, the ground rose into low hills, covered in dry grass. Beyond that, she could see smoke again, closer now, thicker. They made camp by the water, too tired to go farther. The older sister gathered what driftwood she could find and built a small fire, though the smoke made her uneasy. As the flames flickered, she tried to plan what they should do next. If the war the Apache had spoken of was real, heading toward the settlements might not be safe. But where else could they go? They had nothing left, no wagon, no supplies, and no family waiting. When night came, the desert turned cold. Stars looked sharper, almost watching them. The younger sister fell asleep quickly, her head resting on her sister's arm. The older one stayed awake, staring into the fire. She kept thinking of the Apache's face, the stillness in his eyes, the way he had looked toward the north before he left. He hadn't just been warning them, he had been going to fight. For whom she didn't know. Somewhere before dawn, she heard something, a rustle from the brush behind them. Her heart jumped. She reached for the knife again, moving quietly so her sister wouldn't wake. The sound came again, then a voice. "Don't be afraid." It was deep and low, familiar. From the shadows, the Apache stepped forward, his horse beside him, its coat streaked with dust and ash. His clothes were torn at the shoulder and a dark smear ran down his arm. The older sister rose quickly, unsure whether to be afraid or relieved. "You came back," she said. He nodded, eyes scanning the horizon. "You shouldn't stay here," he said. "The soldiers are moving west. They burned to camps already." His voice carried a quiet fury, though it wasn't toward them. "Your people," he added, "think they can take what belongs to the land. Now the land answers." The younger sister stirred awake, her eyes wide. "Are you hurt?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not bad. But others are." He crouched near the fire, rubbing dirt over the flames until they dimmed. "They will come this way soon. You have to leave before sunrise." The older sister stepped closer. "Where should we go?" He looked toward the river, then to the dark hills beyond it. "There's a ridge 2 miles west. Let's go there. Stay hidden until the sun is high." She wanted to ask more. What was happening? Who had started this, but the words stuck in her throat. The weight in his voice told her enough. There was a war now, whether she understood it or not. He stood again, ready to leave. But before he mounted his horse, he turned to her. "You shouldn't have been out here," he said quietly. "The land doesn't forgive those who come uninvited." Her eyes met his. "You saved us," she said. If the land doesn't forgive, then why did you help?" He didn't answer right away. The firelight caught the edge of his face, showing lines of exhaustion and something deeper. Sorrow, maybe. "Because mercy still belongs to those who remember what it costs," he said finally. Then he rode off again into the darkness, leaving them alone with the whispering wind and the sound of the river. When the sisters reached the ridge at sunrise, the valley below was already alive with smoke and movement. From their hiding place among the rocks, they saw horsemen riding in lines, soldiers in blue coats, their rifles catching the light. Behind them trailed wagons, and behind those more smoke. The younger sister's eyes filled with fear. "They're burning it," she said softly. The older one couldn't look away. The Apache's words rang in her head. The war had begun. But it wasn't just soldiers and warriors. It was the land itself, shaking off the peace that had never truly settled. By midday, the sisters saw shapes moving on the far side of the valley, shadows among the cliffs, silent and fast. The Apache were watching the soldiers, waiting. The older sister knew what would come next. She turned to her sister and whispered, "We have to stay quiet. Whatever happens, we can't move." The younger one nodded, clutching her hand. They waited there as the sun burned high, hearts pounding, watching the two sides draw closer. The air was still, heavy with a silence that always comes before the storm. The older sister closed her eyes for a moment and thought of their father's voice, his warnings, his faith in the old ways of the land. She wondered if he had known this was coming. Maybe he had seen that no one could live here forever without the land asking something in return. When she opened her eyes, a single gunshot cracked across the valley. Then another. Smoke burst along the ridge. Horses screamed. The sisters ducked low behind the rocks, clutching each other. The war had found them after all, and somewhere below, through the chaos and fire. She thought she saw him, the Apache warrior on horseback, moving through the smoke like part of it, his bow drawn tight. His shadow caught between two worlds that could no longer share the same sky. Smoke curled over the valley like a dark wave, swallowing the sky. The sisters crouched low behind the rocks, their hands pressed over their ears as the gunfire roared below. Horses ran wild through the dust, their cries cutting through the thunder of rifles. The older sister dared to peek over the edge, her heart pounding. She saw flashes of blue uniforms moving in formation, soldiers shouting orders, their bayonets glinting in the sunlight. Across from them, hidden among the cliffs, the Apache warriors moved like shadows, fast, quiet, striking and vanishing before the soldiers could even aim. It wasn't a battle of numbers. It was a fight for ground, for pride, for something older than either side understood. The younger sister trembled beside her. "Will they come up here?" she whispered. The older one shook her head, though she wasn't sure. "Stay low," she said. The smoke thickened, and the sound of rifles grew sharper. She could smell burning wood. The soldiers had likely set fire to the brush to drive the Apache out of the rocks. The flames spread quickly, racing up the dry grass. Heat licked the air and ash drifted toward them. The younger sister coughed, tears stinging her eyes. "We can't stay here," she said. The older one looked toward the west. There was another ridge, lower but farther from the fight. If they could make it there before the fire reached them, they might be safe. She took her sister's hand. "Follow me, but stay low." They crawled through the brush, keeping their heads down. The ground was hot beneath their palms, the smoke stinging their throats. When they finally reached the slope, they slid down, landing hard among the rocks. From there, they could still hear the gunfire, but it was muffled by the distance. The older sister looked back and saw the valley glowing orange in the morning light. She thought of the Apache warrior again, of his calm, his strength. Was he still alive down there, caught between fire and bullets? She wanted to believe he was. They found shelter beneath an overhang of stone, where the wind carried less smoke. The younger sister leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "Why are they fighting?" she asked, her voice faint. The older one hesitated. "'Cause this land doesn't belong to either side," she said quietly. "But everyone wants to claim it." She had heard men talk about it before, soldiers, traders, even preachers, who said the wilderness would one day be tamed. But standing there with the desert trembling under gunfire, she saw how foolish that sounded. The land couldn't be tamed, could only be respected or lost. They waited through the day, listening. By late afternoon, the sounds of battle began to fade. Only the smell of smoke remained, hanging in the air like something that wouldn't leave. The older sister dared to step out and look toward the valley again. The fires were dying, leaving behind black scars across the ground. She saw no movement, no soldiers, no horses, no warriors, just silence. That silence was worse than the noise. It meant what was alive had either fled or fallen. As the sun dipped low, she saw something move near the edge of the river. At first it looked like a horse. Then she saw the figure beside it, tall, steady, walking with a limp. Her breath caught. She recognized the Apache warrior even from far away. His stride was slower, his head bowed, but he was alive. She turned to her sister. "Stay here," she said, then began to climb down the ridge. The path was rough, the ground slick with ash. She stumbled once but didn't stop. When she reached the valley floor, she saw what the smoke had hidden: bodies scattered among the brush, both soldier and warrior. The sight made her chest tighten. She moved carefully, stepping around rifles and broken arrows. The air was heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The Apache man was near the river, washing blood from his arm. His horse stood beside him, trembling but unhurt. When he saw her, he didn't reach for his weapon. He simply watched as she approached, his face unreadable. She stopped a few feet away. "You're hurt," she said softly. He looked down at his arm, then back at her. "It's nothing." His voice was hoarse. She glanced at the burned ground around them. "The fighting stopped," she said. He nodded slowly. "For now. They'll come back when the wind changes." He picked up his bow and tested the string, though his hand shook slightly. "They always come back." She hesitated. "Can't you go farther north? Away from them?" He looked at her sharply. "And leave my people to die here," he said. His tone wasn't cruel, just full of something too old for anger. "This is our home. We don't run from what's ours." She didn't know what to say. He turned his gaze toward the ridge where her sister was hiding. "Shouldn't stay either. When the soldiers come again, they'll burn everything they touch." She took a breath. "Then help us leave. You know this land better than anyone." He was quiet for a long time. The river hissed beside them, carrying bits of ash downstream. Finally, he said, "There's a place west, beyond the cliffs. The soldiers don't go there. We can walk," she said. He looked at her again, his expression softening slightly. "You're brave," he said. "But bravery doesn't keep you alive out here." Still, he didn't refuse. He mounted his horse and gestured for her to follow. Together, they went back to the ridge to fetch her sister. The younger one looked both frightened and relieved when she saw him. "You came back," she said. He gave a small nod but said nothing. They started west as the night settled in. Stars returned, clear and cold above them. The older sister walked beside the horse, her thoughts heavy. The land around them seemed endless, quiet now, but still alive with tension. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every rustle in the brush made her turn. The Apache man moved like someone who belonged to the land, not a stranger walking through it. He knew where to find water, where to step to avoid rattlesnakes, how to listen to the wind for signs of danger. The sisters followed in silence, their trust in him growing with each passing mile. By midnight, they reached a dry plateau. From there, the view stretched wide, showing the desert bathed in pale light. The older sister stopped and looked out. The fires from the battle were still faintly glowing behind them. She shivered. "Looks like the whole world's burning," she said. The Apache dismounted and looked at the horizon. "Maybe it needs to," he said quietly, "before something new can grow." His words carried the sadness of a man who had seen too much. The younger sister leaned against her sibling, half asleep, her body worn from the journey. The Apache walked a few paces away, scanning the darkness. After a while, he crouched near a small patch of ground and touched the dirt with his fingers. "They're close," he said. The older sister frowned. "Who?" He pointed toward the east. "Soldiers. Following tracks." Her heart dropped. "Ours." He nodded. "They don't like loose ends." Fear tightened her chest. "What do we do?" He looked toward a narrow canyon below. "There's a place to hide there, but you must stay quiet." He led them down the slope, guiding the horse carefully. The canyon walls closed in, cool and dark. They found a small hollow under the rocks where they could rest unseen. The Apache gave them water and stood guard at the entrance. The older sister tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't let her. She could hear distant voices echoing in the night, men's voices, rough and sharp. The soldiers were close. She turned to the warrior, who stood silent in the shadows, his bow ready. He caught her gaze and gave a slight nod, as if to say, "I'll keep you safe." In that moment, she realized something she hadn't before. He wasn't just fighting for his people. He was fighting for the right to exist in a world that was being taken from him piece by piece. And somehow, she and her sister had been pulled into that same struggle. The night stretched long, filled with the weight of things unsaid. Somewhere above them, boots crunched on gravel. Sound grew closer, then paused. The sisters froze. The Apache raised his hand, signaling silence. A match flared briefly outside the canyon, lighting a soldier's face. Young, tired, unaware how close he was to the ones he hunted. Then the light went out, and the sound of footsteps drifted away. When the silence returned, it felt heavier than before. The Apache lowered his bow but didn't relax. He kept his eyes on the darkness beyond the canyon, waiting. The older sister watched him, realizing that the war he spoke of wasn't just between soldiers and warriors. It was between survival and loss, between what the land wanted and what men tried to take from it. As dawn crept in, painting the rocks pale pink, she whispered to her sister, "We can't go back, can we?" Her sister shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "There's nothing left to go back to." The Apache turned toward them then, his expression solemn but certain. "The world you knew is gone," he said. "Now we walk through what's left of it." And as the first light touched the canyon walls, the sound of distant gunfire began again, rolling through the desert like thunder that refused to fade. The morning broke with a stillness that felt wrong. The sky was pale and stretched wide, but the air carried a strange weight, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The sisters woke beneath the canyon wall, cold and hungry, their faces streaked with dust. The Apache warrior stood near the entrance, watching the horizon with sharp, steady eyes. He hadn't slept. His bow hung across his back, his horse tied in the shadows behind him, quiet but restless. The older sister rose slowly and approached him, careful not to disturb her sister. "You heard the gunfire again?" she said softly. He nodded. "They're getting closer." She looked toward the east, where faint trails of smoke were rising again. "They won't stop until they've burned everything, will they?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked almost carved from the stone he stood beside. "They think fire will end this," he said. "But fire only remembers." His words made her shiver, though the morning air was already warming. He turned back toward her then, his expression unreadable. "We move when the sun is higher," he said. "They're searching the low ground now. If we travel through the ridges, we can stay hidden." She nodded, though her legs already ached from the days of walking. "What about your people?" she asked. His gaze shifted slightly, and there was something heavy in it. "Some are still in the mountains," he said. "Others went south. I don't know who's alive." The quiet that followed said more than any words could. When the sun reached its height, they left the canyon and began moving west again. The path climbed through narrow ravines and stony trails where even the horse had to step carefully. The land grew harsher with every mile cracked earth, blackened brush, and the smell of smoke that never seemed to fade. The younger sister tried to keep pace but stumbled often. Each time she fell, the Apache would pause, waiting without a word until she got up again. Never rushed them, but there was tension in his movements, the kind that comes from someone used to being hunted. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. The older sister's breath caught when she saw it. Below them lay what had once been a small settlement, rows of wooden cabins, a corral, and a trading post. Now, it was all smoke and ruin. The roofs were gone, the fences broken, and the air shimmered with heat from the still burning embers. The younger sister pressed her hand over her mouth. "Did the soldiers do this?" "What?" she whispered. The Apache's voice was low. "Yes, they call it taking the land back. But this was never theirs to take." He walked a few steps closer to the edge, looking down at the destruction. "They burned their own treaty here," he said. This was a peace village. His hand tightened on the reins of his horse. Women, children, elders, they didn't fight. They never do. The sisters stood in silence, the truth sinking into them like stones. The older one felt something twist inside her chest, not just fear, but guilt. Her father had believed the army protected settlers from danger, but standing there, she saw the truth clearer than ever. The soldiers weren't bringing peace. They were bringing control. A low rumble cut through the air, thunder though no clouds hung above. The Apache looked west sharply. "That's not thunder," he said. The older sister followed his gaze and saw dust rising in the distance. Riders, dozens of them. The soldiers were back, and they were coming straight toward the valley. "We need to move," the Apache said quickly. He led them down the other side of the ridge, moving fast. The horses' hooves beat softly against the dry ground, and the sisters hurried to keep up. Behind them, the faint sound of shouting drifted on the wind. The older sister turned once and saw the sunlight flashing on metal rifles. The soldiers had seen them. "Run," the Apache ordered. His voice was calm but firm. The younger sister stumbled again, and he caught her arm, pulling her along. The sound of hooves grew louder behind them. The ground shook with it. The older sister's lungs burned as she tried to keep up. They raced toward a line of red cliffs where the land broke into a maze of stone passages. "There," he said. "Go through the gap." They reached the narrow opening, just as the first gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet struck the rock near her head, sending bits of stone flying. The younger sister screamed. The Apache turned, his bow already drawn. He loosed an arrow, and a soldier fell from his horse with a cry. "Keep moving," he shouted. The sisters ran deeper into the passage, the sound of boots and hooves echoing behind them. The path twisted through the cliffs, narrow and steep. The older sister's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. The Apache stayed behind them, covering their retreat, his movements quick and sure. He fired again, and another soldier went down. But there were too many. At last, they reached a small plateau hidden between the cliffs. From there, the valley below looked far away, the soldiers only small figures in the distance. The Apache signaled for them to stay low. He crouched near the edge, watching. "They'll follow the tracks," he said quietly. "But they can't climb this fast." The younger sister collapsed beside her sibling, gasping for air. "How long can we keep running?" she asked. The older one didn't answer. She was watching the Apache. There was something in his expression, not just exhaustion, but determination, like a man who had already decided how far he was willing to go. Night fell slow and red across the horizon. The three of them sat in silence, waiting. Far below, the soldiers made camp, their fires glowing like a trail of sparks across the valley floor. The sisters leaned against each other for warmth. The Apache stood apart, his eyes fixed on the flickering lights below. The older sister finally spoke. "You could leave us," she said quietly. "You don't have to keep risking your life for us." He turned to her, his face calm but shadowed. "If I leave you, they'll find you. And if they find you, they'll use you to find me." He looked back toward the soldiers. "You're part of it now, whether you meant to be or not." His words cut through her. She realized then how deep they had fallen into a conflict that wasn't theirs, how far from safety they really were. Later that night, when the stars came out, the Apache moved closer to the sisters. "Tomorrow we go west again," he said. "There's a canyon that leads to the mountain passes. If we reach it, we can be free of them." The younger sister nodded, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "And if they find us first?" she asked. He looked at her and said quietly, "Then we fight." Sleep didn't come easy. The wind moaned through the rocks, carrying the faint sounds of horses and metal from below. The older sister lay awake, staring at the stars. She wondered what freedom even meant anymore. For the Apache, it meant survival. For her, it might mean losing everything she had once believed in. Before dawn, the Apache woke them. His voice was urgent but low. "They're moving," he said. "We have to go now." The sisters packed what little they had, and they started again. Climbing through the stone corridors as the first light touched the sky, the trail led higher into rougher ground. The air grew thinner, the path steeper. Behind them, the echo of pursuit never faded. The soldiers were relentless. By midday, the heat pressed down on them, and the sound of hoofbeats drifted closer. At the top of the ridge, the Apache stopped. He looked back, his eyes narrowing. The soldiers were near, their voices echoing through the ravine below. He turned to the sisters. "Go ahead," he said. "Stay close to the rocks. I'll hold them here." The older sister shook her head. "Can't fight them alone." He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw fear there, not for himself, but for them. "If they take you, it won't just be the end of you. It will be the end of what I've done." Before she could argue, he took his bow and stepped toward the edge, his silhouette framed against the sky. Below, the soldiers were climbing fast, their rifles raised, shouting orders. The sisters moved, as he said, climbing along the rock face. Every sound, every breath seemed too loud. The first shots rang out. Dust burst from the rocks near them. The younger sister screamed as a bullet grazed her arm. The older one pulled her forward, forcing her to keep going. Behind them, the Apache fired again and again, his figure moving with quiet precision. Then came a shout. The soldiers had flanked the ridge. The Apache turned, caught between two sides. His horse neighed sharply, the sound echoing through the canyon. The sisters looked back, helpless. He stood tall against the rising smoke and sunlight, his bow drawn, his face set with a calm that only came from knowing what must come next. The gunfire grew louder, the sound of it rolling through the mountains like thunder. The sisters climbed faster, the rocks tearing at their hands, their hearts pounding with fear. The older one turned one last time and saw him standing at the edge, outnumbered but unbroken, facing the storm alone. And somewhere deep inside, she knew that whatever happened next would change everything, not just for them, but for the land itself. The air trembled, the wind rose, and the next shot split the silence in two. The gunfire faded slowly, echoing through the mountains, until it became only a whisper. The sisters crouched behind a cluster of rocks, their hands trembling, afraid to look back. The younger one pressed her wounded arm against her chest, whispering through clenched teeth that she was fine. The older sister could barely breathe. She wanted to run back, to help, to scream his name, but fear held her still. Smoke drifted through the canyon, soft and gray, carrying the sharp smell of gunpowder. The world seemed frozen between silence and memory. Minutes passed before they dared to move again. The older sister looked down from the ridge. The soldiers had stopped chasing. Their horses were retreating, scattering down the valley below. The ground near the canyon's edge was scarred, and there, through the haze, she saw him. The Apache warrior stood still, his bow fallen beside him, the wind tugging at his hair. He was wounded, his shoulders streaked with blood, but he was alive. Relief flooded through her so suddenly she almost cried out. He stumbled slightly as he made his way toward them, steadying himself against the rocks. When he reached the sisters, the younger one tried to speak, but emotion caught in her throat. The older sister reached out, helping him sit. "You shouldn't have stayed," she said softly. "You could have died." He looked at her with calm eyes, pain in his expression, but something else too, quiet acceptance. "If I hadn't stayed," he said, "you wouldn't be here now." They rested until the sun sank low. The world turned gold and quiet again, as if the fight had never happened. The Apache bound his shoulder with a strip of cloth, his movements slow but steady. The sister sat beside him, saying little. There were no words big enough for what they felt: gratitude, sorrow, fear, and the strange bond that had formed between them through all that had happened. When the light began to fade, the Apache rose. "We have to keep moving," he said. "They'll come back when darkness falls." The sisters nodded and followed him, though every step was heavy. The mountain trail curved down into a wide plateau where wild grass grew between the stones. The wind carried the sound of distant water. They followed it until they reached a hidden spring, surrounded by rocks and thin trees. It was small but clear, a rare sign of life in a wounded land. They made a small camp there. The Apache gathered dry branches and built a quiet fire, careful that the smoke wouldn't rise too high. The sisters sat close to the warmth, their clothes torn and faces streaked with dirt, but for the first time in days, they felt safe enough to breathe. The younger sister leaned against her sibling's shoulder and whispered, "Will we ever go home again?" The older one hesitated before answering. "Home isn't there anymore," she said softly. "But maybe we'll find another." The Apache listened, though he said nothing. His gaze was fixed on the fire, but his thoughts seemed far away. After a long silence, he spoke. "There's a valley beyond these mountains," he said. "No soldiers, no towns. My people used to hunt there before the land was taken. It's empty now, but the earth still remembers us. You can rest there." The older sister looked at him carefully. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you go back to your people?" He smiled faintly, a shadow of weariness in it. "If any are left," he said. "If not, I'll stay with the land. It doesn't forget those who belong to it." His words hung in the air like a promise. That night, the stars came out bright and close. The sky seemed endless, and for the first time, peace settled quietly between them. The sisters drifted to sleep beside the fire, while the Apache kept watch. His eyes traced the constellations above, the same ones he had known since childhood. He thought of his father, of his tribe, of the songs that had once filled the valleys. So much had been lost, but in that moment he felt a fragile kind of hope, the kind that survives when everything else has burned away. By morning, his wound had begun to heal. He packed what little they had left and set out again. The path ahead was long, but the air was clearer, the wind softer. The sisters walked side by side, their steps steadier than before. The younger one hummed under her breath, a small tune that echoed softly between the rocks. The Apache listened and almost smiled. They reached the valley 2 days later. It was green and quiet, surrounded by low hills. Wildflowers grew along the stream, and deer tracks marked the soft earth. It was untouched, hidden from the world that had forgotten mercy. When the sisters saw it, they stopped and stared in awe. "It's beautiful," the younger one whispered. The older sister nodded. "Feels alive." The Apache dismounted from his horse and walked ahead, kneeling to touch the grass. "This was sacred ground," he said quietly. "My people called it the Valley of Healing. Now, maybe it can be yours too." They built a small shelter near the stream. The days grew gentler, the nights cool and peaceful. The sisters learned how to gather roots and herbs, how to make fire from flint, how to listen for signs in the wind. The Apache taught them patiently, speaking less now, but always watching, always protecting. Over time, they no longer felt like fugitives. They felt like part of the land itself. Fragile, yes, but alive. Weeks passed before the older sister dared to ask the question that had lingered in her mind since that day on the ridge. "You think they'll come again?" she asked one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills. He shook his head slowly. "Maybe. The world doesn't stop hunting what it doesn't understand. But if they come, they'll find nothing worth taking." His words were steady, but there was a sadness in them too. She understood it then, the grief of someone who had lost everything and yet found a reason to keep walking. She reached out and touched his arm lightly. "You gave us more than our lives," she said. "You gave us a way to start again." He looked at her, eyes soft with something that felt like peace. "No one gives what already belongs to the earth," he said. "It just finds its way back." As summer faded, the valley grew even quieter. The younger sister's arm healed and she began to laugh again. The older one found strength she hadn't known she had, and the Apache, though scarred and weary, seemed to find something close to belonging. One morning, he rose early and rode out toward the far hills. When he returned at dusk, his horse was dusty, and his face carried a calm that the sisters hadn't seen before. He said he had found signs of others, faint tracks, a broken spear, a fire ring left behind. Maybe some survived, he said. There was a light in his eyes, fragile but real. The sisters smiled. "Then you'll go find them?" the older one asked. He nodded. "Yes. The land needs its people back." That night, they sat together for the last time. The fire crackled softly, and the stars shimmered above like distant lanterns. The wind carried the faint sound of water and rustling leaves. The older sister felt a deep stillness in her chest, not the silence of fear, but the quiet that comes when something has ended and something new is ready to begin. When morning came, the Apache was gone. His footprints led west, toward the mountains, where the sun was rising over the peaks. The sisters stood for a long time, watching until he disappeared into the light. The valley around them was alive with color, the grass bending in the wind. They stayed, tending the land he had shown them, growing roots in a place that had once been only a hiding ground. They spoke of him often, not as a savior, but as a man who taught them how to survive with honor and heart. And though he was gone, his presence lingered in the quiet of dawn. In the sound of the stream, in the peace that had finally found them, the land healed slowly, as all wounds do, and so did they. The world beyond the mountains would go on fighting, burning, and rebuilding. But in that hidden valley, life returned in its simplest form. There was no more running, no more fear, only the soft rhythm of days passing under open skies. And in the calm that followed, they learned something the Apache had always known, that home isn't a place you find. It's the ground you learn to stand on when everything else has fallen away.